So, hello. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's wonderful to be here and in such a magnificent venue. We are, I think, just going to crack straight on with the questions. Sathnam, you are a journalist, and you had been a celebrated author before Empireland. So, what prompted you to write a book about the legacies of British imperialism, and why did you choose 2020, 21 to write it?
Why did I decide to set fire to my life? I was quite happy before Empireland. Thanks for inviting me, by the way. What an amazing venue. I was going to go from here to Wolverhampton and the Midlands, and I've been stopped from returning to Dudley by Storm Dudley. So I'm going to have to go straight back to London. But yes, why did I write the book? Basically, for the same reason I ended up writing most of my books, in that I had a bit of a crisis, in that I got to the age of 43. I was doing a documentary about Jallianwala Bagh for Channel 4, went to India, and I realized that I knew almost nothing about empire. And the average man on the street in India knew quite a lot. And the more I read about it, the more I realized that empire explained so much about me, why I'm here, why this audience is so diverse, is because of empire. It explains why the Sikhs see themselves the way they see themselves, because that identity was largely created by the British. Explains why the Sikhs exist, arguably, because so many people converted to Sikhism in order to be indulged by the British. And yet, I knew almost nothing about it, and I supposedly had a great education. And so I decided to fill the gaps in myself. And so that's how Empireland came about.
And the incident that you mentioned, about which you were making the documentary, you described it by one name. We might know it by a different name. So could you describe what exactly happened at what we know as the Amritsar massacre?
Yes, and actually, people struggle with saying Jallianwala Bagh, and actually it took me myself 2 weeks to learn how to say it, so don't be embarrassed. But yeah, it's often known as the Amritsar massacre. It's 1919, 100th anniversary 2 years ago, and it was when General Dyer, as a representative of the British Empire, turned up in Amritsar, the Sikh holy city, on a holy day, and saw hundreds of locals doing what he thought was a protest against British Empire, but was in fact just a gathering of people on a holy day, and killed, I think, up to 700 to 900 people.
Estimates are still debatable.
People debate the estimates. Yeah. Kim Wagner says, I think, around 700. And some people argue it's the point at which the British lost control, or lost the moral right, if they ever had it, to have an empire. And so it was a seminal point, not just for Sikhs, because it was in the Sikh holy city. A lot of Sikhs were killed. Also, Sikhs were involved in the shooting. Some of them were Sikh soldiers. But also, it was a seminal point for people like Gandhi and Nehru, and the point at which some people say empire ended.
Yeah, and it is an event that many people will have seen a representation of for the first time in Gandhi, in the 1982 film. But it's also it's an event that I think encapsulates the divergent and very disparate opinions about what happened in the British Empire, because as much as Dyer was censured within the military, there was also a public pension raised on his behalf. And so, looking at empire and looking at events like this from both sides, how is the British Empire remembered in the Punjab?
It's remembered in a mixture of ways. My grandfather was generally quite pro-British, and he would talk about, he's illiterate himself. He was a farmer and then a factory worker in Wolverhampton. He would talk about how the British came along and irrigated the Punjab and helped to make it rich, which is an argument you hear in the Punjab, but I think you hear it less and less. I would say 90% of the Indians I've ever met have quite negative views of empire. I don't know what your experience is.
I think we can both say that neither of us would be here in Manchester tonight if we did not have in our ancestry a legacy of imperialism. I might have been on a different side. If you have a name like Taylor and you have an accent like this, you were probably a colonizer rather than somebody who was colonized. In terms of how your book has been received, I mean, we've read the reviews, we know how well it's sold, but how have you been received as the author of such a book?
Well, I try to force myself, as a result of a lot of therapy, to focus on the positive, and it has mostly been positive. You know, teachers are using it to teach kids about empire, and it's already been out for a year, and I need to focus on that because, you know, there's been a lot of negative trolling, death threats, quite a lot from the right wing, but actually quite a lot also from the left. One of the bizarre things about doing the documentary was that I was rediscovered by the Corbynistas, because I signed a letter during last election saying Jeremy Corbyn wasn't fit to be Prime Minister because of anti-Semitism. And since then, that, I guess, momentum focused on me quite a lot as one of the people who betrayed the Labour Party. And people found out I was writing this book and making the documentary, and the Corbynistas decided that I didn't have a moral right to talk about racism because I personally stopped the most anti-racist Prime Minister in history from being elected. So that was a surprise. Went on for 2 or 3 weeks. But also, the biggest surprise has been actually doing events like this. I think this is pretty much my final event, and I'm not doing many events this year, because basically people have started trolling me in real life. And so I don't know if someone's come here to just shout at me, but basically people do that. So it's always men, not necessarily white, actually get some Indians as well, who turn up at events like this and shout at me for about 10 minutes about being too negative about British Empire and how I should be ashamed.
Well, I would say that if you're pissing off both the extreme right and the extreme left, you're probably doing the right thing. I would also note that who've also written a book about the questionable legacies of empire over the last couple of years, have received none of the similar abuse.
You can have some of mine.
That's a very gracious offer, but I will decline. But you can draw your own conclusions about why that might be. One of the really interesting things that your book does, and you mentioned about how it's being taught in schools, is about how we learn about the empire and almost how we come to judge it. And the word judge is in itself prejudicial, but it's really about how we assess the empire. So is there a right way to do that, or is there a wrong way?
Well, there's definitely a wrong way. And today in the news, we've had the government, I don't know if you've seen the news today, the government have issued guidelines on how to be balanced when talking about empire. And that's because we have always talked about empire in terms of balance. There's an idea, the balance sheet, that you can weigh the positives of empire, for example, the railways, against the negatives. Tens of millions of people dying in famines and being murdered in massacres. And I think that argument is finally dying off because it's ludicrous. You wouldn't say about the Holocaust, were there good and bad things about the Nazis? You wouldn't say that. And I don't see why it's acceptable to weigh deaths against the railways, or which I argue in the book weren't even a benefit, you know. But
there may have been an incidental, unintended benefit. But the railways were not put in place to develop India's economy for Indians.
No, but I mean, you only need to turn on the TV around this time. I think on BBC Two, I bet you Michael Patilla right now is getting off a train in red trousers, talking about how we'd given the Indians this gift of the Indian Railways. And it's not true, but this is the way we look at empire in this country. We can blame certain people. We could blame Niall Ferguson, I think. We could blame Jan Morris. But actually, Jan Morris, I mean, I always recommend as a book to read. It's a beautifully written book, but very nostalgic about empire. But you should listen to what she said about it in her final year. And she completely rejected her own work. She said, I'm ashamed I wrote it. And that's why I tell people to read it. Because you can actually, I think even children can have the critical judgment to realize when things are slightly over the top or not.
No, that's true. And you mentioned Niall Ferguson and Neil Ferguson, and I think the very first page of Empire, he lists 9 reasons why everybody should be grateful for the existence of the British Empire. One of them is team sports. Now, I love Test cricket, but I'm not sure it was worth the lives of 3.5 million Africans who were enslaved and trafficked by the British. which maybe goes to sort of a balance sheet is a really facile approach to this.
Yeah, I don't even like cricket, that's the problem. I mean...
Well, I think we should just end this here.
Well, it's the cricket test, isn't it? The Norman Tebbit test. I feel like I would fail the cricket test because I don't like cricket, you know?
That's true. You just mentioned a really important word, which is nostalgia. And I think a large part of the culture war in which we have found ourselves effectively unwitting combatants, it's not really about history. It's about history versus nostalgia. So is there a way that we can actually disentangle those two things and explain that they are very different?
Well, ultimately, we're talking about culture wars, aren't we? The phrase culture war, it gets bandied about. I don't think people define it. And actually, I'm reading that book by Alan Lester here, and he defines it very well. But for me, a culture war is basically a battle between people with traditional values against people with progressive values. And the subject matter, the locum through which they argue could be anything. It could be pret-a-manger, you know, the type of TV you watch. It could be empire. And I feel that we're endlessly having these culture wars through prisons, but the most toxic is empire because it encompasses all the most toxic conversations on the planet.